good evening and a very, very warm welcome to each and every one of you here this evening. My name is Mark Oakley and I'm the Chancellor here at the Cathedral, and thank you very much for joining us for our St. Paul's Institute event this evening. It's entitled The Protestant Work Ethic and the Changing Nature of Work. And this event is the last in this cathedral's programme dedicated to the 500th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation, as dated from when Martin Luther published his 95 Theses. You can find recordings of some of the other events, by the way, in this series on the cathedral's website. And of course, it's been quite an anniversary around the world. There have been a raft of programs and books and television shows highlighting the anniversary. We've heard about the 95 Theses as the first social media post, given how new the printing press was. And Lego has even, of course, created a Martin Luther character. And thanks to German friends, I now own both a Martin Luther cookie cutter and a Martin Luther bath duck. Particularly in this world of social media, what has been interesting is to watch, of course, how many different groups have used the event as a hook for their own cause. And in honesty, we've also done a bit of that this evening here. St. Paul's Institute has been working around the topic of meaningful work for some time in a variety of programs and events, and based here, of course, in the heart of the financial city of London, as we are, issues of ethics and good work and work-life balance have long been on our radar. Luther is widely recognized as being one who reminded society of the spiritual significance of work. He wrote, "The works of monks and priests, however holy and arduous they may be, do not differ on whit in the sight of God from the works of the rustic labourer in the field or the woman going about her household tasks. All works are measured before God by faith alone." Talk of vocation then was now to include domestic duties, civic duties, and employment. And that, of course, begs many questions, not least about the meaning of work and the meaning of vocation. What we hope to do this evening is start with a discussion on work as a burden versus work as a gift. A little on whether Weber's link between the Reformation and the thriving of capitalism in his famous work, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, was legitimate. But mostly on what the future of work has in store for us in light of all the technological changes ahead and how that will affect our own self-definition and our own sense of purpose. And to do that, we have a truly marvellous panel this evening. So let me hand over at this stage to Barbara Ridpath, who is the director of St. Paul's Institute and who will moderate this evening's discussion. I wish us all a very provocative evening. And once again, welcome.
Thank you, Mark, and good evening. Let me add my welcome. And as Mark mentioned, many of us have focused during this anniversary of the Reformation on Luther's justification by grace alone, but he also affirmed that the only true way to serve God was to serve common people through normal and often menial tasks. This made any and every role in which one has consistent interaction with other individuals a vocation. In so doing, it is he that gave work a spiritual significance, or at least talked about it that way for the first time. So, as Mark mentioned, we're going to hold a conversation about work as burden versus work as gift, and whether work needs to serve others to be vocational, a little on whether Weber's link between the Reformation and the thriving of capitalism is actually legitimate, but mostly on what the future of work has in store for us in light of the technological changes ahead and how that will affect our own self-definition and our own sense of purpose and of meaning. Now, before we turn to our panelists, I think it might be helpful for the panelists to know a little bit about what you think about this and what brought you here this evening. So there'll be time later in the evening to ask questions, but right now I'd like a show of hands on a couple different questions. First of all, could you raise your hand if you think of work as either a burden or something you do just to make a living? Could you raise your hands if that's why you work? Okay. Not maybe self-selecting audience who comes to something like this. And the other way of thinking of that question is, could you raise your hand if you work for pleasure, self-fulfillment, or service to others? Do you think it's an average audience? It's a definite majority. All right, and the second question is, how many of you in the audience worry that technology will take away your current job in the next 10 years? Not too many, but a few. And how many of you think that technology will make your work life easier or more interesting in the next 10 years? More. This is a pretty optimistic audience I think we're working with here. So thank you. And that's very helpful because it sets the scene of the audience we're talking to. So it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Richard Sennett, who I would argue hardly needs an introduction. And this is where I need to confess a complete academic crush on the gentleman to my right, and recommend to you any and all of his books, which I might also add are for sale outside in the chapel after the event. But Richard has been thinking and writing about the effect of work on character, on issues of craft and community throughout his career as a sociologist. Yet his approach and his writing is often aimed at a wider audience without academic qualifications, for which I personally am enormously grateful because I find his books eminently readable. You have his biography in your program, so I will only add that we are extremely grateful to have you. Now, given Richard's experience, he can talk about anything he'd like as far as I'm concerned, but hopefully he will touch on some of the issues we've raised. Okay. It's all yours.
Yeah, okay. Well, I want to thank you for inviting me. I know St. Paul's Cathedral mostly because my grandson is a chorister here, so I know a very different part of the cathedral than we're in. I thought I might just say a few words that connect Max Weber to work today. This book, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, brings most historians out in hives, and if you are suffering hives, I can't do anything to help you about that. But I can explain to you why people keep reading a book which is so flawed in its facts. Weber wanted to account the transition from works to work, from the Catholic world of indulgences and remission of sin, to something where work was a more inner condition, people struggling with the question of their own predestination, not knowing whether they were destined to heaven and hell, and yet feeling somehow they couldn't just say, well, it's not up to me. And it's about a tension that passes into the capitalist world about showing that you are a worthy person by working in a certain way, where you save rather than spend, where you are a kind of ascetic. He calls it worldly asceticism, that you are trying to demonstrate to yourself by your ability to gain but not spend that that you are a good person. Of course, you can't demonstrate this to God, because God has already, in the Calvinist mode at least, destined you to heaven or hell. So it's an attempt to show the anxiety that work produces about people's self-worth. And to me, it's a provoking book because it focuses working on the person at work. When I wrote the Craftsman book, so cheap and so easy to read. When I wrote the Craftsman book, the one thing I found is that good craftsmen are not focused on me. They're focused on it, on doing a good job, on what constitutes a good job. And that craft could be everything from physical labor, like a potter, to social crafts, like my team interviewed groups of nurses who thought of nursing as a craft. But it wasn't about how it made them feel, but about what the work was in itself. So in a way, what Weber is cautioning us against is too much focus on how we feel when we're working, which inhibits us from focusing on it, what we're doing it well, being of service to others, doing a good job rather than being a good person. And that's a fundamental kind of tension, I think, in the whole modern world of work. Whether it's making us feel good or fulfilled, or whether we're really getting out of ourselves into doing something that has its own shape and form. And that's why I think reading Weber, who is a critic of work as self, is still, it's very valuable today for all of its historical and theological errors, of which there are many. Can I just say one more thing about Weber? Max Weber wrote this book after a trip to the US. And as a former American, I can tell you that it resonates for Americans, perhaps in a way it wouldn't for you Brits, because what he saw was a country absolutely dedicated to working as hard as it could, but often for no purpose, for no tangible reward. Families destroyed by people working 16 hours a day who didn't need to work that much. People driven by ambition who would have had a better life if they'd been more modest in their ambitions. So the Protestant ethic, it's a very peculiar, to me, American book, or today perhaps we'd say it's a Chinese book of people who work endlessly without really thinking, what am I doing?
Thank you. This is one I probably need to declare an interest because 3 of the 4 panelists are originally from North America. And I don't know if there was any sort of selection bias when we were thinking about this topic and ended up with so many North Americans.
Maybe driven by work.
I guess, if I may I ask you a follow-up before I introduce Nick? What I think is interesting about that is the distinction between work, how much people who are working understand the purpose of their work, and whether there's a distinction between the satisfaction or the meaning that comes from work where you understand what it's contributing and where you don't understand what it's contributing, or you can't see what it's contributing.
Yeah. Well, I think that's certainly part of it. I mean, for physical craftsmen and for some artists, the notion of just getting it right is a satisfaction, whether it contributes anything socially or not. And when we did our nurses study, for instance, it was very interesting that the most skilled nurses were the ones who saw this in service of having a relation to their patients. It's quite different than the way a potter would think about it. You've got to get that pot right, no matter who's going to use it.
Interesting. So next I'm going to welcome Nick Srinick, who is speaking at the Institute for the first time. Nick is a lecturer in the digital humanities at King's College London. So the reason for his inclusion, I think, on the panel should be obvious. But more than that, in 2015, Nick was co-author of a book titled Inventing the Future, Post-Capitalism and a World Without Work. It would be difficult to find someone better at this subject than our next speaker. I have to say, since he's a university lecturer, I'm tempted to set him an essay question, which is that in the book of Genesis, the Abrahamic God cursed Adam to a life of endless labor for eating the forbidden fruit, saying, "By the sweat of your brow you will eat your food." So the question is, has the rise of machines given humanity an opportunity to be free of that curse? Discuss.
And write neatly.
Well, I want to sort of start with a question of, is work necessary for a meaningful life? And I think instinctually, a lot of us would say yes. And there's actually a lot of good social science research which says that if we look at communities or individuals who lack work, we see much worse social outcomes. So we see much worse physical health, we see much worse mental health, we see all sorts of social illnesses arise in communities and individuals that lack work. And we were talking earlier about a story in the Financial Times on the weekend about Blackpool, this massively depressing story about a community that has high levels of unemployment, high levels of antidepressant use, and it's basically just a sort of miserable scenario. Now, I think we should be cautious about this research, though. And I think the reason why we should be cautious is because work, in the way that we've organized society, is the primary and often sole access to income, and it's often the primary and sole access to social relations. So in a world where work is the key mechanism to getting an income, to getting social relations, to getting some sort of social recognition, I don't think it's any surprise that taking away work would mean we have poor social outcomes. But the point is, that's unique to capitalism. That's the way that work is organized in our economic system, and that's not necessary. So I think a lot of these studies are actually reflective of the way that capitalism is organized, instead of any sort of innate, natural necessity to work for a good physical outcome. So the question I want to ask is now, is work necessary for a meaningful life only under capitalism, or is there some sort of trans-historical necessity to work for a good life? And I think there's reasons to be skeptical. And I want to point to three groups who I think are pretty indicative of the fact that we don't need work. First is children. Children don't work in any meaningful sense, but they seem to have a very fulfilling and meaningful life, and they seem to enjoy a lot of life as well, much more so than most of us, I would wager. Retired people are another good example. I've never seen my parents so happy until they were retired.
It's because you left home.
Yeah, that too. And it's interesting because when you retire, oftentimes a lot of people will end up doing volunteer work, doing charity work. They'll do things which are maybe work in some broad sense, but it's not paid work, it's not work that's designed to get an income. And lastly, my favorite group of people that don't work is the royalty. And personally, if it's good enough for the royalty, I think it's good enough for the working class. So I don't think the work ethic is sort of as naturally ingrained as we possibly think. Now, there's a really interesting recent survey that came out about 2 months ago, done by YouGov, and they surveyed 2,000 British people, and they asked them, what amount of money would it take for you to retire that day? Now, the unsurprising result of this was that younger people said they wanted a lot more money before they would be willing to retire. So it ranged from, 100,000 pounds to, say, £1 million or more. But I think the really surprising aspect was that 88% of people said that at a certain amount of money, they would retire that day, and they would never work again if given enough money. Now, I think this suggests that actually the main motivation for a large group of people is money and not any sort of intrinsic value in the job that they do. And of course, if you're retired, this doesn't mean that you sit around doing nothing. You're suddenly given opportunities to do other things. Now, a second reason to be skeptical that the work ethic is a part of human nature is the entire field of management. Management is the discipline which is designed to reproduce the work ethic in workers every single day. It's a science which is designed to try and inspire some sort of desire on the part of workers to actually want to work hard and produce for a corporate project. And of course, that's incredibly difficult. And management has been trying to grapple with how do you control workers and shape workers into a force that actually wants to work. So I think the fact that we have management shows that the work ethic is not something which is natural. Now, I want to conclude by just sort of offering a suggestion about if we didn't have the work ethic, what would a society look like? And I think this is actually a bit more difficult than it seems. In a lot of discussion of the post-work future, from any number of sort of science fiction writing and all sorts of writing on this stuff, writers often reinscribe the work ethic in some sense. So they'll imagine this sort of post-work world where robots are doing all the jobs, but suddenly we have to socialize with people all the time. We have to produce these fancy meals for our family all the time. We have to do all sorts of laborious tasks all the time. And my wife, who absolutely despises this stuff, is always like, this sounds terrible. I don't want to be cooking all the time. I don't want to be socializing all the time. And I think she really has a good point, that this is work in another sense. And to reimpose the demand that people have to be making these fancy meals all the time is a reimposition of the work ethic in a sense. Now, I think there's exceptions to this, and Paul Lafargue's famous book, The Right to be Lazy, is a very nice sort of manifesto for the right to idleness. And I think that that's quite a significant shift away from the work ethic. But of course, even forced idleness can be a sort of work. And if you imagine a child, an impatient child, and you ask them to wait for 5 more minutes, you can tell that it's work for them. So I think even idleness can be a sense of work. So how then do we imagine a post-work ethic world? Well, if we distinguish between autonomously chosen labor, work that we freely chose to do, and externally imposed activities, what a post-work world would look like is at least the reduction, the massive reduction in externally imposed activities and the expansion of freely chosen work. And I think if I could sum it up in one sort of phrase, a post-work ethic world would be an expansion of our capacities to do rather than a new imperative to act. So giving us the abilities to do as much as possible without forcing us to do any of it out of necessity. Thank you.
Interesting. All right, so I'm going to challenge your theory. I think it's interesting about what people would do if they suddenly had enough money. But you hear, what would the evidence of lottery winners do? Do lottery winners cruise the world on luxury ships for the rest of their lives, or do they go back to work?
I think oftentimes they go back to work, but this is maybe a flaw in the survey. So I think oftentimes people will underestimate how much money they need for the rest of their lives. Especially if you're quite young and you try and imagine, 50 years, how much money do I need to survive for 50 years? That's hard to imagine. And I think at some point, particularly with lottery winners, you do run out of money and have to return to work at some point.
Interesting. I'm going to be curious how our next speaker responds to the management challenge, having been a management consultant. Dr. Eve Poole is our next speaker, and no stranger to St. Paul's Institute, as she is one of our associates. So we're delighted to have Eve speaking, not only because we find her terribly good value, but especially because this evening she brings the perfect combination of a business strategy background with a doctorate in theology, which permits her a take on vocation that combines both, I hope. So with that, over to Eve.
So we're here to celebrate this year the Reformation, and particularly tonight to think about the idea of vocation that came out of this thinking. And I think it's worth just revisiting a bit of history on that before we think about what that means for today. Because in Britain, we have an older tradition than the Reformation about vocation from Celtic spirituality, particularly in Ireland, but also in the islands of Scotland. So, owing a lot to the monastic tradition, there was always a tradition in these islands of hallowing your work. In those days, of course, most of the work was very domestic, and it was about the animals and the hearth. And there are lots of beautiful Celtic prayers about, "Come, Mary, milk thou my cow," and "I will build my hearth as Mary would," and lots of everyday prayers to help you churn the milk, help you feed the babies, help you gather in the ewes, all of those things that people had to do in order to survive. And because of the way Celtic spirituality imbued every element of living, then of course your labor was very much part of that. Of course, when we were all frightfully grown up and industrialized, we were very influenced by Hellenistic ideas of work being something a bit grubby that only people who didn't have land had to do. And we know from ancient Rome that leisure was something that only was exclusively for the most top-notch types in society. And of course, we had a rather grubby view of people who worked for many years. So one of the things that was particularly triumphant about first Luther and then Calvin was they recovered for us this idea of vocation, not just for menial work, but for professional work as well. So it wasn't just that blue-collar workers ought to take pride in their work. It was that all work is prayer, laborare est orare, which again was something that we all knew about from the monastic tradition, but had perhaps forgotten. The thing about vocation, though, is it's been rather overtaken by an obsession with the end of work, why we work. And I have been writing on workplace spirituality for about 15 years now, and I had a very interesting moment at Ashridge Business School where I teach leadership, where I had the temerity to put on a non-compulsory evening workshop for one of our strategy courses about workplace spirituality. I was surprised and delighted when all of the people from our strategy course turned up, I think largely out of curiosity. And I started talking about meaningful work. I'd been talking for about 5 minutes when a rather senior lady from Tesco shot to her feet and had a total rant and stormed out. And she said, "You know, my drivers would feel patronized by this irredeemably middle-class view that one ought to have meaning in one's work." So I own that I'm probably irredeemably middle class, assuming that we ought to have meaning in our work, and that while I think that is theologically sound, I should own the privilege in me that comes, imbues my thinking about that. But I would also note that a lot of our theological heritage has not been about middle-class pursuits. It has been about the everyday, ordinary activities of keeping the show on the road. So as well as the end of work, are we proud of why we work? I think vocation is also about how we work. And on our panel tonight, we have Richard, who has written very beautifully in The Craftsman about dignifying the work. And he talked just now about nurses and the craft of those kinds of activities. I think it was Dorothy L. Sayers that talked about serving the work in the professions. And it is about making things beautiful. So it's not just why you're doing your work, but how you're doing it. And I think, again, that's something that we do well to repay, because there have been many people who have worked hell-bent on a good end, but have perhaps not imbued the means to that end with as much spirituality as they could have done. But I want also to talk about work in the sense that we've been approaching it through this panel about the misconstruction of work as just paid labor. Because, of course, Celtic spirituality, it was just your occupation. You know, you needed to build the fire, you needed to milk the cow in order to keep your family afloat, and it was a subsistence sort of a life. And I think because of the Industrial Revolution and because of some of this thinking we've been hearing about, we have got overly identified with work as a paid activity. And therefore, we have huge mental health problems if we don't have paid work, because it's very much tied up in our sense of self and purpose. I find myself in an unusual position, which I guess many women in the room will have had, having had children where you're not available for full-time paid employment for a while, and you end up being a bit like a retired person doing a sort of portfolio career in between nursing the twins. So I've ended up at the moment with this typical portfolio, which I imagine we all have in the future, which is I do maybe a third of my time as paid work, and the rest of it is either the family or a variety of voluntary roles that I hold. And again, I think it's very interesting that these debates get taken over by worries about our occupation in terms of the value society puts on it. So I wanted to end really by getting you to think a little bit about that for yourself, about what work you think is worthwhile and how you are defined by your work. Which work are you most proud of and why? So I have a K here because you may have heard this very trite saying about why do you work? Is it for the K or the Ks? Have you heard that? So do you work for the knighthood, or do you work for the thousands of pounds that you might get? And for a long time, there was a view that you couldn't really have both. Obviously, the last few Queen's birthday honours have not kept that separate. But there was this idea that you had to choose. You could either do honourable work that would get you in one of these chapels around here, or you could absolutely crack on and pile up as much loot as you could, treasures on earth, as we've heard in the Gospels. But I have a third K, which I think is more relevant for, I shouldn't really have three Ks, should I? One to rule them all, a Trinitarian K, which is to try and not worry about that as a choice, should you do worthwhile work or lucrative work, but to think about the K of the kingdom, however you understand that. What kind of society are we trying to build? In Christian terms, we're trying to create the kingdom around us. We're trying to live a life that we think God would bless us for being in relation with other people. And I wonder how much of your work is for the kingdom, how much of what you do with your time is direction towards the sorts of pursuits that build the community around you up, whether that is paid or unpaid. Because I think when we're talking about vocation, it's your entire life's calling. And given what's coming down the track around AI or minimum income wages or whatever, we need to be much clearer ourselves about what we think our talents are, and therefore how we want to live our lives out, expressing those in the world in order to leave the world a better place when we leave it than when we arrived. Thank you.
Thanks, Eve. That was great. And as a commercial for this chapel, this, in addition to being called St. Faith's Chapel, it is also the OBE Chapel. So just in the event you're working for honors and not money, should you ever succeed at that, you can be married here, you can have baptisms here, and you can have your funeral here. So that's what happens when you work for the Ks instead of the one K instead of the three. When you were talking, because certainly in my life I've had to do some of the juggling you're currently doing, but do you think one of the reasons that that is a frightening solution to people is because it requires them to take more responsibility for the outcomes if they are directing their own career?
I think so, but I think it makes you very clear about what value you add. Because if you're not available for full-time work, you need to figure out what kind of work do you need to do. So when I first had my twins, I had made provision financially not to have to work for some years, but I found myself drawn to work, mainly in a voluntary capacity to begin with. And then I found people wanted to pay me to do some work. So of course I said yes, because why not? And you end up after a few years with this rather accidental portfolio where I often do the same work. Some people pay me for it and some people don't. And so some people value it financially and some people don't, but they're a charity or whatever, I'm doing it for free. So I think it gives you a very different insight into what money is about in the work economy in those kinds of environments. Now, I should say I have had traditional jobs. So I have had jobs not only working for the Church of England and Deloitte, but also at a business school. So I have had that experience of full-time work and trying to get work-life balance right. And I suspect those kinds of jobs are of the past these days, and that it will be much more in the future that we'll be doing small pieces of expert work in whatever our sphere is, and then correcting around that for enthusiasm, service, interest that we have. So I'm enjoying the feeling of what will probably become a pattern for so many people in order to learn what it seems to mean and how you might be able to learn how to do it well.
Thank you. Now, we're going to go to audience questions in a few moments, but I'm going to use the privilege of the moderator to ask our panelists a couple of things myself. I'd like each of your views on how we got to the place where work has become so obsessive. And we may all have nice thoughts about a balanced life, and some of us are closer to attaining it or not. But at least the four people here have obviously been interested enough in their work that they're here tonight talking to you about it. And they're not clearly 9-to-5 employees, but they work pretty hard if they do day jobs and write books and take care of families. So what is it that provides that motivation, both for each of you and do you think more generally?
Well, if I start, I think work has become an idol for many people, and I think it's caught up in the whole capitalist narrative, which is that the potential to be able to consume has become an idol, which is why we want to have a lot of money, because we feel that we've got to feed a machine where we'll never quite be complete, we'll never quite have enough. And because so much of our self-expression, self-definition, and apparently social worth is tied up in our occupation. Mark was telling us before we started about the game he plays. Well, he tries not to tell people his profession for as long into the conversation as possible. And I think we all find when we're out and about, people want to know, what do you do? And it's very tricky if people are newly retired or they're workless or they've taken time off to have children, to figure out how to answer that question. It's one of those tricky moments. Because people then sort of the eyes react to what you say and you've been categorized. And there seems to be no shame in working extraordinary hours and never seeing your children, which I think is an interesting modern problem, because we should be shaming people who miss their children's parties and don't come home until too late to put them to bed, because that's not a sensible way to construct society, I think.
Richard?
Well, this is a very deep question you ask, and I think it divides into two parts, which is that working, in the sense of having a vocation, is a narrative, and it's something that stretches over large periods of people's time. I think of many of the working class people that we have interviewed at the LSE are people who don't get much job satisfaction, but the notion of working in order to pay off a mortgage or own a house is something that gives work a kind of meaning to them as a long-term process. And these are people doing jobs that don't have much content, but they're given the content because of this long-term this narrative that creates a vocation. I'd say the other thing about this is that the difference of having that kind of narrative or not is rapidly becoming a very coercive, very painful issue today. You know that in Old English, a job was a lump of coal that you could move around. You had a job of coal. whereas a career was a road on which that lump could be moved. And what Old English conveys by that is the notion of the difference between working, which is short-term, ephemeral, we would say today, zero-term contracts, and working, which is part of that narrative of the long road. My worry is that it's very hard to create out of jobs, short-term, zero-contract labor, a sense of vocation in work. And I think it's lamentable that this government in apprenticeships, for instance, has oriented people towards a kind of labor which is very short-term. They're being trained to do things which is not a sustaining path of work. For instance, programming rather than physical labor like plumbing, which is something, the programming is something that comes and goes, and it fluctuates with the labor market. Capitalism makes it something that is very unvocational in that sense. It's a skill, but it's not a vocation. And I think what we need to do, I believe in work as a vocation, is find ways of training people to do those kinds of things which they can sustain in their lives over a long period. And we're just not focused on that in the policies of training that we have today. So I guess my answer to you about this is really what we need are more vocations rather than more jobs.
Nick?
So I do political economy, which means that I'm quite interested in the sort of economic reasons and sort of, I guess you could call them non-human in a sense, that it's not under the control of any personal decision. But capitalism as an economic system, what it's both very good at and also to the detriment of us, is that it's a system of increasing productivity. So it allows us to produce items in a much more efficient manner. This is why we can, with a handful of people, do as much farming and as much agricultural production as we did with entire populations 100 years ago. Capitalism is constantly trying to increase productivity. Now, what I think we see, looking at this economically, is that we see increasing productivity is slowing down in capitalism. So this is one of the major issues that economists are concerned with right now, is why isn't productivity growth growing anymore? And what that means basically is that the technologies that we have are actually not increasing productivity. And under those circumstances, capitalism sort of has to turn towards generating more productivity from the workers rather than from machines. Now, for me, this means that capitalism is forcing workers into increasingly sort of constrained situations, a move away from careers towards gigs. All the sort of precarious work that we see today, I think, is an expression of this sort of fundamental tension within the economic system. And I think political decisions still have a role to play in sort of mitigating the worst of that, but I don't think it can completely eliminate that fundamental problem in capitalism.
Interesting. Now, I could do this all evening because this is my subject and I love it, but I'm going to try not to abuse my position and give you all the chance you need to ask your questions. So Jody over here has a roving microphone. If you'd like to ask a question, raise your hand, and she and I will try and manage to get to as many as possible to speak. Do please try and tell us your name and make your question and comment as concise as possible so that everybody gets a chance. And we'll try.
Hi, my name's Sally Rush. My question is, childhood and retirement are relatively new concepts, particularly amongst what was the working class, which is
Right.
now the middle and working class, which have emerged in parallel to the evolution of capitalism. And we're now seeing the impact of that in the UK and elsewhere with issues around funding pensions and funding student education. I'm worried how we're moving more to digital work and saying that there'll be a time when not so many people are in work. How are we actually going to support people in this changing landscape where those who have seem to have more and those who don't have inherited wealth are already struggling?
And next to you, just
Hello, my name is John Bryant. Nobody on the panel has used the word happiness tonight.
the word
Happiness. And it seems to me that there is an interrelationship between work and happiness for some people. Some people, it's a drudgery and they don't get happiness from their work, and other people do. And what is the future interrelationship going to be between work and happiness? Are we likely to see happier workers doing less time in doing their activities? Or is the digital age going to make us more unhappy because we'll have fewer vocational jobs for us to pursue?
Okay, and then still on this side, there's one in the front row, and then that'll give people time to think about their answers.
Yeah, I thought it was, you said the audience was oddly optimistic, but I thought the panel was strangely optimistic. And what I remember from reading the Max Weber book a long time ago is that in the last pages he talks, I think, about a cage or a prison or something like this. And there's the sense in the whole
iron
book,
cage, yeah.
there's a sense in the whole book of the kind of tragic perversion of religion, really, that
Absolutely.
what begins as a quest for salvation ends up in this
Yeah.
cage. And I think that kind of dimension was missing from what was being spoken about, because surely we live in such an era where everybody's, what people are allowed to hope for and expect for financially and in terms of careers is being destroyed in front of their eyes. And so I was a bit surprised by I think one answer to this, difficulty was provided by the last speaker in terms of the third K and the third, of the kingdom. But it was a rather kind of pragmatic life as we already live it kind of version of the kingdom. Whereas it seems to me the Christian story, if it's relevant to this topic, is one of repudiation and rebellion and turning away and refusing the constraints of the cage and giving up, if necessary, everything in order not to, go along with a world which is made into a cage. So, I thought that was a part of the answer, but a strangely kind of moderate and one that refused to look at the bars of the cage.
Thank you. Any volunteers for who'll take which one first?
I'll go.
Nick.
So the first question, as I understood it, basically how to fund things like retirement and education, particularly as these things expand. And I think this is increasingly a problem because we have a demographic change that's going on right now. So we have an aging population, we have fertility declining, so we have fewer and fewer younger people, which are acting as basically an income tax base to support people in retirement and support people who require long-term health care and things like that. It is a difficulty, but I think we can solve it. I think if we look at something like tax evasion, the upper estimates for that in the UK are 130 billion pounds a year of tax evaded. If we look at the cash gluts that various corporations have around the world, in America alone, a company like Apple has $270 billion sitting around doing nothing. Overall, corporate America has $2 trillion sitting around doing nothing. Now, this is money that under proper circumstances could be taxed, could be enforced that they're actually properly paying the amount they should be paying, and we could fund things like retirement and healthcare and education quite easily, I think. For me, it becomes just a matter of politics rather than necessarily some sort of fundamental limit. And maybe on the second question, I'll just add, about happiness. I think the ideal for me, the ideal future situation is not a world without any work, because I think that's impossible. But I think the ideal is to work much less and in work conditions that do foster happiness. So I think we're always going to have social responsibilities to each other, which are going to feel like work at points and times. You know, taking care of children as much as you love them can feel like work. Taking care of elderly parents can feel like work at times. You know, even taking care of a partner when you've had a long day can feel like a lot of work. But that's a social responsibility that we buy into as part of society, and I think that is always going to be there. But at least we can have, you know, we don't have the sort of imposition of this 9-to-5 job that we despise and then come home having to take care of, emotionally, of the rest of our lives.
I need to put in a moderator's caveat that we were talking about this in the room and behind here, and Richard warned me against using the word happiness, which is one of the reasons we were talking more about meaning than happiness, which is why we didn't mention it. But I'm going to let you try and explain why.
Okay, I'm very suspicious of the word happiness. And I'm theologically you can tell where I'm coming from, I'm very suspicious of it theologically. But I'm suspicious in the work world because the engineering of happiness has been something that employers have trivialized to very minor forms of job satisfaction that actually have made people less combative and resistant against the employers themselves. There's a famous study called the Hawthorne study, which is about that workers, if they are spoken to and recognized by their employers, called by their last names rather than their first names, this is part of a larger study, that they're happier about it because they're recognized as somebody who has standing in the firm. Doesn't do anything for their wages. It doesn't do anything for the character of their work. You can think about this in a modern context in terms of the way Google and other firms try and destroy the line between home comforts and working in the workplace as a way of making people feel more pleasure at work because they can have sushi and so on. But it also keeps them at the job. Google employees work an enormous number of hours. They're slaves to the workplace. I think the provision of happiness is a technique of managers for disciplining and repressing employees. There are aspects of working, particularly in a capitalist society, which people should rebel against. They should be unhappy about the conditions in which they find themselves. And the notion of making a satisfied worker, to me, has always got this substratum of making a complacent worker. Now, as I say, since we're in the cathedral, there is also an issue, I think, at a deeper level about the pursuit of happiness versus the pursuit of meaning. A lot of the things that make our lives meaningful are things that are very difficult and often very painful. It's only a child's world in which we are fulfilled by being constantly in a state of pleasure. We know as Christians that's not adult life. And yet when we talk about the work world, we revert to this kind of infantile, and I would say amoral version that work should be a form of pleasure. I'd say one more thing about this. In the craft world, the process of acquiring a skill, I tell you, in my own case, I was trained as a musician, as a cellist. I suffered, and most musicians and most craftsmen suffer with resistance, difficulty, frustration every day. And if you say, oh, it doesn't make me happy, you're never going to learn how to play the cello. You know, there is something wrong about the notion that labor is a form of pleasure. You know, it's wrong theologically, it's wrong in terms of political economy, and it's wrong in terms of acquiring the competences to work well.
I'm feeling slightly self-satisfied because in an earlier career, I remember somebody telling me they weren't having fun, and I said, that's why we call it work. That's why we call fun, fun. Eve?
So I'll assume, Sally, if I may, that Nick has answered your question, but if I could answer John's and Weber guys together, I'd like to sort of redeem happiness a little bit, but I think try and sort of recontextualize it. One of the reasons that Tesco lady was so cross with me about my workplace spirituality was she regarded it as yet another capitalist technique to improve productivity because we weren't getting enough out of the machines. But if we could make people hyper-motivated because they thought they were doing it for God, then they might stay late. So I think there is a danger, and it weaves back round to this idea of the cage. I think in Weber and in Tawney, there is this concern that we might have used the Protestant ethic to build a ladder towards a more productive form of capitalism, but that we kick the ladder away at our peril. And I think there is a danger because of the very neoliberal utilitarian mindset we've got into in the capitalist society we've got at the moment, that we're so hung up on utility, we conflate that with happiness, and that's a very individualistic notion, that if individually, because of the invisible hand and competition and all those other lovely things, we just try and pursue our own utility, that will somehow create global happiness. Which is why I think it is revolutionary to talk about working for the kingdom, not the K or the Ks, because it's actually trying to tell you that you're not just a person on your own ploughing a utility furrow. You're in community and actually trying to figure out how the sum total of all your activities, both work and leisure, could be building up the kingdom around you, is about thinking in relation, so that it's no longer around my occupation, my happiness. It's about what am I contributing to the whole, because that's about being of service as well as about fulfilling our vocations as a species and a community as well as individuals. So I hope that helps. I do agree that there is a risk that we try and make all work seem like an opportunity for incredible self-fulfillment where we still need really horrible things to be done. And so there is a danger that management try and use that narrative manipulatively, particularly around vocation, mindfulness, all these other things that we're encouraged to embrace in order to keep us working harder and for longer and healthier. But I also think that it is also a clarion call to all of us to think more globally about what we think happiness is and how our work connects to that.
Thanks, Eve. All right, there's a hand on this side near the aisle, Jody.
Thanks. Stefan Stern. When my daughters were learning to spell, they were a task which is not yet complete, I might add. They were told that that was a kicking k, the K. And there's another word with a curly k, which you could also consider, which is commonwealth, or the common good, but a sense of broader purpose. Nick's point about management is absolutely right. I don't think managers can motivate people. They can certainly demotivate people. Peter Drucker said most of what we call management consists in making it harder for people to do their work. But related to this desire to be a craftsman, there are three other words we could talk about that Dan Pink, the psychologist, has popularized, which is to say mastery, which relates to craft, I suppose, autonomy, in that sense of choosing to do, having some say of what you're doing, and purpose, which gets into meaning. And those might be useful.
What is the third word?
Purpose.
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 I was reminded because Dan Pink actually kindly tweeted a piece I'd done for very little money a couple of months ago about the chef, the Michelin chef in France, who has renounced his 3 stars because he just wants to cook nice stuff that he likes.
It's interesting. The first time I heard those 3 expressed in his book, I was thinking that sounded pretty good to me for the end of my career. I didn't know that I would have that choice at the beginning. But if I could find work in this stage of life that had autonomy, mastery, and purpose, I'd be doing pretty darn well. But it's probably true at any stage in your career. We haven't heard from anybody on this side of the room. Is there anybody on this side in the back? Jody, if you can do a runner towards the back, there are 2 there.
Hi, I just wanted to say to the panel, automation is definitely here. I recently went to my bank, and the bank manager was standing there by himself. He's got a machine next to him. He said he got rid of all the customer service. He doesn't need anything. And I was just wondering, with also driverless cars coming soon, what's the point of that? And it takes the fun out of driving. Is it possible? And also the city jobs and the lawyers' jobs, also the high-end jobs are under threat with automation, with the smarter machines coming out. What does this mean for the future, and will it cause upheaval? Thanks.
Was there another question in the back? Right over there, Jody, way back in the far.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Gavin McCready, and I have a 3-part question, which is, firstly, current capitalism, can we spectrum that between idea or institution? Part 2 would be, does current capitalism have something of a God complex? And I suppose 3, if so, then is it positive or negative? Thank you.
Well, shall I start off with those? Stefan, thank you. It would have got me out of my 3 Ks if I'd thought of Commonwealth. My daughters are also learning spelling, and of course they're learning that the curly K always has to come before the kicking K, otherwise the kicking K kicks it out of the way. So, in fact, Commonwealth before the K or the Ks would be a lovely way to express it. Thank you. I think there is something quite important about reimagining, rehabilitating the manager's role. Again, as part of Marx, trade unions, agency theory, all this rubbish nonsense about who we are at work and our role in work. We've got this very adversarial idea about management, and many of our lived experience has been that management is the sort of dead arm that stops you doing anything helpful, positive, or creative. There has also been a very devastating undercurrent in theology about managerialism to rubbish that as a profession. People like Alistair MacIntyre did a massive number on telling you that you were of the devil if you were a manager. The thing about being a manager is if you understand work as craft and apprenticeship, then what better vocation could there be than being a manager? Right. Because then you are using your mastery to develop the image of God and their creativity and ability in all the people around you. It's a much more paternalistic reading of the role than we are maybe used to from the sort of capitalist theories that we've had. But certainly when I write about management, I do try and encourage people to think about that as a vocation in its own right, rather than thinking about the particular job that the manager is doing within the particular company they're in anyway. Just to comment briefly, because I know the rest of the panel are more expert than I am on this, around the sort of AI takeover. It's not just Neil Stephenson. Pretty much every sci-fi writer ever has talked about what this will be like. You know, when the robots have taken over, what do humans do? So I don't think it's that we don't know. I think, you know, there's always a dilemma about what is it, what value do humans add, and what is the relationship between the people and the machines. And what tends to happen in most sci-fi plots is that there is always a place for humans because humans like dealing with humans. And eventually, you know, after several wars with the machines, the humans come back. So it depends really on whether you're optimistic or pessimistic about it. But again, as a consumer, you have some choice around that because brands will start differentiating, as some now do with call centers, about whether you want to be answered by a machine or a person. So you will have more choice than I think we imagine currently with the headlines on that. Gavin's questions about capitalism. It's both an idea and an institution at the moment because it's embedded in our rules. Institutions are just sets of rules that we have to abide by. The idea is so strong and so embedded that the only way we'll shift the institution is by changing our ideas. And there's an excellent book written by Eve Poole called The Toxic Assumptions of Capitalism at the back, which unpacks this in a bit more detail. God complex. I think capitalism has kicked away the ladder. I think that's the entire point about this problem of using a kind of Protestant ethic to fuel capitalism, and then being rather careless of that as not only a motivator but a guarantee of particularly the likelihood of people obeying the laws you require them to in order to keep capitalism going. We're seeing the fruits of that, I think, at the moment. So I'll be interested to hear what the others say about that too.
Nick?
Yeah, so I might talk about the automation question because that's sort of my research area. In terms of AI, the idea that we'll have a sort of Terminator scenario, I think is incredibly unlikely. I think what's more likely is the scenario you find in the movie Her, where at the end of the film, basically the AIs in Her are just completely indifferent to humanity and just go off and do their own thing. I don't think a super intelligent artificial intelligence would care enough about humans to just stick around and destroy us. That's the good news. In terms of more realistic questions about automation, for me, the really interesting question, well, actually, let me raise one point, which is just today, Uber announced that they're buying 24,000 cars, and they're going to outfit them with self-driving sensors, and they're hoping to get these by 2019, 20 to 21. So the next few years, Uber is hoping to have a massive fleet of self-driving taxis out. So this stuff is happening, and it's happening, I think, much more rapidly than a lot of people recognize. Now, the interesting question for me is what work does remain? What work can machines not do? And it turns out the work they can't do is a lot of social work. It's what we might call social reproduction work. So it is taking care of children. It is looking after elderly people. It is doing healthcare work. It is doing emotional labor, affective work, social labor, all this stuff. Machines are not good at it. Now, for me, when we look at how this work is done in society today, it's not socially valued, it's not well paid, and it's not recognized as anything that we should be doing. It's sort of like, it's not an ideal situation. It's not what most people are aiming to do. So what I think we need to do is really re-question and revalue those sorts of jobs. I think we actually need to socially recognize them as being some of the most important work that we can do. We have to pay them properly, so pay our nurses properly, pay our teachers properly, and we have to also socialize it. So a lot of work right now is incredibly individualized when it could be socialized. So childcare, house cleaning, elder care, healthcare, a lot of this stuff we could reorganize in much more efficient ways that take away the burden of work, which is often placed on individual women, and place it on a family or place it upon a community. And I think that we can completely change that. And with robots taking other jobs, we have the opportunity to be able to reorganize it. So that's what we need to do.
Okay. Richard?
Well, I agree with that entirely. I wanted to respond to your the 3 points you made about mastery, autonomy, and purpose. When I think about working, which is what I study, not work as a category, but what people actually do, I would say that these are pretty slippery categories, if I may say so. One way that you get better at a skill like surgery is not that you move from success to success. There's a dialectic always between failure, resistance, and relearning a skill at a higher level. Unfortunately for surgeons, that can also have rather dire consequences. But it's true in every kind of skill. And it means that we're always in a situation where we're undoing a kind of level of mastery we have in order to do something better. And it takes a peculiar kind of environment for people to do that, where they can fail. So I think mastery is a very problematic category, as is autonomy. The one thing I've found in studying this subject is that people always learn better in groups and from other people than they learn as autonomous, skilled people. And unfortunately, the advent of computerized learning and so on has made people less sociable in their learning, and therefore learning at a slower and more superficial rate than if they were learning in groups. And that affects the third of your categories, purpose, which is part of the purpose of work is the address to other people, just what you were saying, you know? People who are intensely self-absorbed as workers can only do a very limited form of task. They're good at making some forms of vast quantities of money, but there are other things they're terrible at because the purposes of work are the purposes of self. And that's what Weber, coming back to your point about this, that's Weber's critique. That's the iron cage, that basically you are alone with a task. And in my view, what we have to do is find ways to socialize the process of working rather than put people in that kind of iron cage in which they are autonomous, in which their purposes are clear to them as individuals, and in which they have fixed modes of mastery. That doesn't seem a good way to work to me. I'm sorry to be so critical of this, but I just feel these are very problematic categories.
But interestingly, a lot of people get from work a social aspect. If they're working in a company or a big office, it's actually the social part of the pleasure of work is the social atmosphere that goes with it. And when they're out of work, they then find that they're isolated, and it's much harder to socialize because we've put the social into the work, and it's part of the reason maybe your wife says it's going to be a pain in the neck to have to socialize outside instead, you know, because that's so much of our time is spent in a social atmosphere in a workplace.
Well, you know, it's interesting if we never think about, say, military life as a form of labor. And what is disastrous, if any of you have been in the military, what is disastrous is what's called the cowboy syndrome, which is you know how to fight and you go out and fight by yourself. That is a recipe for destroying the very things that allow people to survive. And in a certain way, when we talk about sociability, we think of it, the reason I mention this is we think of it as a kind of sugar, you know? And there are forms of work in which it's anything but sugar. It's the work can't get done otherwise. I think that's also, may I say, I think it's true in the church, that the notion of individual faith is something that doesn't really lead us to faith. You know, I think we need to have, as you were saying, we need a very expansive understanding of what working is about. Much more than just thinking that it's something, it's a utilitarian means to an end. It's unreal, you know. I know Margaret Thatcher wouldn't agree, But then Margaret Thatcher, well, anyhow.
Now, if there's anyone that has an absolutely burning question, there's room, but I have a question I'd like to ask each of the panelists before we close. So all right, Jody's going to find us one more.
Hi, my name's Lona. There's been a lot of talk about management, but apart from the Tesco van drivers and the soldiers, there hasn't been much about working class jobs, which are probably going to be the ones that are going to be the hardest.
Well, could you just repeat that quickly, because we're having trouble understanding, or stand up, that might help.
Yes.
I actually can't stand up.
Oh,
I'm terribly sorry,
right.
I'm in a wheelchair. I was talking about working class jobs because I think they're going to be the first to go when AE takes over, and I don't think we're going to get very meaningful replacements. And I wondered about whether creativity and entertainment might be the way forwards, and what the panel thought about that.
If I could start on that, I think I share your horror really with, if I can imagine that's how you're feeling about the very skewed nature of the hysteria that there has been recently about AI. And it's actually not because of working class jobs going, it's because it's the first time that the professions have suddenly thought how many of their jobs are at risk. So if you think about the dear old city, banking is first in line. So actually the working class jobs, if we can call them that as a category, are probably safer because a lot of them are physical and social. And actually it's about paying them properly, recognizing what they contribute to society, these roles, rather than applying class categories. So I'd be very interested to hear what Nick says, because this is his area of expertise, but I wanted to sympathize with this as a really important point, is that we should have been talking about the quality of jobs forever, not just suddenly because people in the city might lose theirs to a robot.
Well, so what technology often takes is what economists call routine jobs. So they're jobs which you could sort of set in advance a series of steps for doing them, and you could write down those series of steps. Now, that could be a manual labor job. It could also be a mental labor job. I grew up on a farm, and that was a lot of repetitive physical labor I absolutely despised. I worked in a factory for 5 years, which was physical labor, highly repetitive. I absolutely despised it. But the job I hated the most was call center work, which is repetitive mental labor with no chance to step away from that physical labor or that labor and be able to think for yourself. At least in the factory, I could be putting boxes on a line and I could be imagining other things. With the call center job, I couldn't even have freedom in my head. But this is what automation can take, is these sorts of routine, repetitive jobs. It can do it very, very well. It's already replacing this sort of work. And I think you're absolutely right. The creative jobs are jobs that will continue to grow and survive. I think a lot of emotional labor jobs and social jobs are things which machines are just not good at. And they will continue to survive for the foreseeable future. So that stuff will grow, but we have to socially recognize it and pay for it and everything.
Great. Now, as a last, I'm going to give you 2 questions, and you can choose which of the 2 you'd like to answer, but I'm going to set yet more exam questions. I obviously am a frustrated teacher. Nick was saying at the outset that the problem we have with work is a function of the capitalist system. If you were actually recommending how to change this system to get from where we are now to where we want to be, what would each of you suggest needed to happen? And then the second question, if you'd prefer this one, is that when I read Mike Keynes, he promised, I think, a 3-hour working day because of both capitalism and technological improvements, and he promised that back in the 1940s. And at least in many classes of work, not all, but many, what technology has done is given us more work, whether that's emails or paper processing or waiting online with a call center. I see an awful lot of heads nodding here. And we feel like we have more work and more tasks than we've ever had because of technology. So are we just creating work, which is what's decreasing our productivity with some of this technology? You can each pick one or both of those questions to answer, and who goes first?
I can go first. So I'll take your first question. What could be done? For me, two answers. One is, first of all, a reduction of the working week. So this is a classic demand of the labor movement. If you look at, when the working class movements arose back in the 1800s, their demand was for not just necessarily good work, but less work. It was the 8-hour working day. It was the 2-day weekend. These were the fundamental demands of the labor movement. I think we should be pushing at a minimum for a 3-day weekend. I think this is good in terms of mental health, physical health. I think it's also crucial for responding to climate change. So one less day of people commuting to work, one less day of factories and offices running. There's a huge amount of energy that could be saved if we weren't working as long as we are. So a reduction of the working week is the first one. A second one is something we've probably all heard of now, universal basic income. So the idea that you take away the coercive force of wage labor right now by giving everybody sufficient amounts of money to survive. So you don't have to take the first job that you come across, which is often, a terrible job. Numerous studies have shown that if you give people more time to search for a proper job, they'll find a job that's more appropriate for their skills, a job that's better paid, a job that is better suited to them. So let's get rid of that coercive element which forces people into the first job by giving everybody a universal basic income, giving people a choice of whether or not they want to take care of their family or whether or not they want to make some extra money through a job.
So the book I mentioned about toxic assumptions is exactly how you would change the capitalist system, and it is about putting more women into senior positions because they have a different physiology as well as being more decorative in the boardroom. Arguably, that's the interior design approach to diversity. Mine's also physiological and mathematical. Calling out toxic assumptions like shareholder value, utility, invisible hand, agency theory, all these myths which are nonsense. We can't reform our capitalist system while we have flat earth thinking. I would be a fan of basic income. I think there are lots of practical things we can do as consumers. There are some public policy things that would be helpful, but to be honest, our public politicians are making such a hash of things. I'm not sure we really want to wait for the grown-ups to sort us out. We can probably do quite a lot to that on our own, thank you very much. I do think there is a big problem about us hogging work. If you think about the crisis of worklessness between ages 18 and 24 at the moment, even higher than that, and the crisis of overwork in the sort of 40s and 50s-year-olds, there is a problem about everyone overworking. So a 3-day weekend might help with that, but it's also about restructuring jobs to make the jobs that are available more widely distributed and fairer for people. With work-life balance, I think it is getting back to monastic thinking about the balance that there needs to be between labor and leisure. And I think we've become quite rubbish at leisure. We're not very good at it. And we tend to fill it up with things that are a bit worky because we're not very good at being idle. So I think there is a huge opportunity that might be afforded by a combination of AI and citizen wages for us to rediscover our talents at being a bit more idle and enjoying leisure as well as work.
And Richard, the last word?
Well, I also believe in basic income, but in, I think, a different way than you do. And that's because I'm basically a driven Protestant. And I think that people, they get things from the struggle to work and all of the dynamics of being productive that are important to forming a sense of purpose in the world. My version of basic income, which is my version of basic income is one that's linked to job sharing, so that it's not a question of working or not working, but that jobs are reorganized, divided up so that, say, 3 people can share one job. This is what the Dutch have done so brilliantly. And I think the French are going to start with this as well. I think people need to have the experience of a long-term effort that makes demands on them and that which working at a task does. Since work is shrinking, the number of jobs is shrinking, what we really have to do is provide the floor of basic income, but give people a chance to keep working. And I also think that's just. Since I'm probably one of the oldest people in the room here, I can say that the idea of retiring and living off the labors of the young is something, I find sort of, I find it repellent. I think people should and need to work as much as they can and as much as is possible for them to do, and that there is something fulfilling about labor in the long term that is part of being human. So I think we're in a very different starting point, although we come to the same end point.
Mm-hmm. And the question is whether it's because you started as a farm laborer and you started as a cellist.
Oh, well. I don't think so. That's true.
Since we ask you some questions at the outset, I'd like to ask some questions at the end, but it's mostly out of curiosity, and they're not too taxing. I want you're going to raise your hands for one of three things. I am more optimistic about the future of work than at the outset of this discussion. I am less optimistic about the future of work than I was at the outset of this discussion, or I haven't changed my view. So who among you are more optimistic? Okay. And who among you are less optimistic?
Yes.
And who hasn't changed their view? Oh, so everybody was listening, but you haven't convinced everyone. All right, so I have told you already, but I will tell you again that there is a book table outside of the chapel if what you heard this evening entices you to wish to read more by these authors. Please watch our website for the 2018 program, and please join me in thanking our panelists this evening in a traditional manner.